Thank you very much. I see the time has already started, so I better get going. I am a substitute for a couple of people who dropped out, and I was called in at the last minute. So some of the slides you're seeing are perhaps not quite right for an audience like you, so perhaps you'll forgive me. Great talk from Sarah, talking about, in fact, solutions to the problem that I'm going to be talking about. So I kind of feel maybe our paper's the wrong way around. I've just written a book called The Gendered Brain, which is actually looking at the way in which brains get to be different. It's called The Gendered Brain because it uses sex and gender as examples. But as an autism researcher, I'm really interested in how any brains get to be different. I think every brain is different from every other brain. But within that book, because of another interest of mine, and that is the underrepresentation of women in science, I realised that it's actually a great case study for the history of how women and have been treated as inferior by science, and the way in which science itself really needs to look to its own house to understand why it is that women are still choosing not to do science. Okay, so next paper, right. There's a huge number of issues in this area, as Annalise identified and also Sarah. But the one I want to focus on now in the next few minutes is what's called the gender equality paradox in science, in STEM. And this is a narrative which is emerging in the last few years, where in spite of all the initiatives, very worthy initiatives undertaken by organisations like this, and certainly in the UK, the Institute of Physics, there still remains a big gender gap in science. And strangely, the biggest gender gaps in science are in those countries which have the smallest gender equity gap. So effectively, think Scandinavia, those countries where there's a much smaller gap between men and women in terms of financial independence, political representation, access to education, etc. Now, the reason I'm concerned about this is because there is a kind of subtext narrative emerging, particularly with papers like this and another paper which I'll mention, where the story goes something like, we give women all these opportunities, they have great education, they perform well, and yet when they're given the choice, because they could choose to go into science because it's clear that their performance is equal, they choose not to do it. And I love this phrase from this paper: the differences emerge from a seemingly rational choice to pursue academic paths that are a personal strength. The story behind these data is that they looked at over 30,000 individuals in about 33 different countries, tracking the gender gap as a function of how gender equal the countries were, and found indeed that places like Finland and Denmark had much greater gender gaps. The explanation was science is generally a career, lots of you might not agree with this, which is financially rewarding. And if you're in a country, an underdeveloped or recently developing country, then economic drivers may make you choose a career which seems to be financially very rewarding. If you're in a country where economic drivers might not be pushing you in that way, then you have a seemingly rational choice to make. And one of the things these authors focused on was that although the girls were doing as well as the boys in science, they were doing much, much better in what they called reading skills. Now, I'll let you ponder on the suggestion that you don't need reading skills to do science. But the suggestion was that girls were very good at these particular topics, and that's why they chose to do them. So again, we have a focus where the blame is being put on the individual. The girls are not making the right choice. And if you look at the kind of story, different explanations of why women don't do science, it comes right back to our own research area, blame the brain. The suggestion is that for some reason there's something wrong with women's brains, and that goes right back, way back to the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, where all sorts of tremendously misogynist statements were made about women's inferior brains. And effectively, the story, particularly with respect to science, was that women didn't have the right skill sets. And I won't go through all of these, they'll all be familiar. They didn't have the right skill sets, poor at spatial cognition, they didn't have the right temperament or personality, and we get the Mars-Venus dichotomy. They don't have the right preferences, and this people versus things trope comes up a lot, and that's something I wrote about. And they have other academic strengths. Women are good at other academic things if they're not off being womanly companions to men, quote 19th century neurologist. The gender paradox was really, what is this? If, as neuroscientists, and we know both neuroscientists and psychologists have, in the last 20, 30 years, really started looking at these data properly and saying, as Annelies mentioned, that we should be thinking about gender similarities, and the differences we thought we had are kind of disappearing. So maybe there's another explanation for why women aren't going into science, and this is really echoing what Annelies and Sarah have already said. Is it the case that given a free choice, you don't choose to go into a subject which isn't welcoming, where there are dramatic gender gaps, where there aren't the right kind of role models? And so in the time remaining to me, I'll just give, you probably don't need me to tell you how science isn't always a welcoming field for gender and other for women and other minorities. So it's just really to say we have some of the answers as neuroscientists, psychologists and social psychologists and developmental psychologists too. So I'll just quickly go through these to show that we do have science to counter this argument. Apologies, this is one of those science festival slides which I really shouldn't have put up in front of a panel of experts like you. But this is really to say that our brains are not only wired to carry out higher level cognitive functions, they're also wired to be social. And indeed, it's claimed that the reason for success in the human race is that we are social beings. We still have the kind of mechanisms which colour the effect of our behaviour. So if we make a mistake, we're sad or angry. If we do something well and are rewarded, then we're pleased. We also have a system within the brain, which I think Annelies has referred to, and I've just referred to it here as the go-no-go system, or the error-evaluate system, which really is constantly monitoring the outcome of particular actions. Now, the reason I'm drawing attention to this social brain is really, and I won't go into this in a lot of detail, is being social is a very important driver in the brain. In fact, it turns out that social rejection, for example, if you get people to play a strange little game in the scanner where there's two figures throwing a ball to each other, some of you may be familiar with the cyberball game, and then you come in as the third player and they throw the ball to you for a bit and then they stop throwing the ball to you and only throw it to each other, and you actually, even though you're in a scanner and you know it's only a cartoon game, you do find that you are put out. And you can actually score, the psychologists will score the kind of self-esteem or drop in self-esteem ratings. And they find that actually there's quite a marked effect of a loss of self-esteem. Even though you're lying in the scanner, your brain is activated in a particular way, in fact in the go-no-go area. And similarly, if you set up a task where people are rejected by the group that they want to be associated with, that again leads to a loss of self-esteem. And if people have very high expectations of themselves, that again leads to a particular kind of behaviour where people become very self-critical. They blame themselves for not making the progress they should. So it all comes back to the individual. And I put this up rather shamefacedly, the worst kind of sin, you know, throwing brain imaging data at people without proper axes and things. But it's really just to illustrate that a life of low expectations in whatever culture you're in does change the brain in a particular way. And you can see that in this case, this is the rejection sensitivity I showed you. This is somebody where self-esteem, a particular game they're playing, resulted in a loss of self-esteem. This was where people were asked where they felt they were in a particular pecking order. And this was somebody asked to imagine themselves in a very self-critical state of mind. So we can see that our brains will actually respond in a very powerful way to a culture of whatever kind, which has a fairly dramatic effect of lowering our self-esteem. And the psychologists have also come up with the ways of describing this. So low levels of self-esteem are associated with high levels of self-doubt, well-known imposter syndrome, high levels of self-criticism, being very sensitive to the fact that if you're in a gender imbalanced situation, you may find yourself being really anxious about being treated differently because of your gender. And this leads to the kind of behaviour which social psychologists have called self-silencing, where people, and this is actually looking at women in particular, withdraw from the situation, they don't complain, they don't seek help, they become more and more withdrawn from that situation, and they may disengage with the whole situation, and they may indeed withdraw from science. So what any kind of institution is doing to somebody's brain will affect their brain. As we've seen, this will affect their behaviour. And I think it's a very relevant story for understanding why women drop out of science. So does science have a negative view of women? Well, this rogues gallery, you might say I'm cherry picking. I don't think I'd describe this lot as cherries. But so one of the greatest scientists of all time, Charles Darwin, had a very distinct view about the inferiority of women. In fact, he thought they were lower down the evolutionary scale. And you think, okay, that's 18th century. You know, we've grown up. We have an equal, valued view of women. And yet, you will all be familiar with these public outbursts. Larry Summers, 2005. Describing the lack of women at higher end of maths and engineering because different availability of aptitude. James Damore, who wrote the ex-Google engineer, who said that the distribution of preferences and abilities of men and women in Google differ in part due to biological causes. And my friend Alessandra Strumier, who named and shamed me as well, in fact, in CERN last year when he stood up and said that physics shouldn't be wasting its money on educating women to do physics because effectively there was clear evidence of gender differences in their interests. So you can say that we know that stereotype threat, as was indicated, can affect us quite profoundly. So if you're moving in a culture which clearly has a particular view of a group to which you belong, then that probably will make you feel a bit inferior. Do you belong? Looking at the stereotypes of scientists, and you might say, well, again, these are old-fashioned. I did come across this. This was 1950s. So this was a questionnaire handed out to boys and girls to see what their views of scientists were. So this was what the boys got, and this is what the girls got. So we have moved on a bit from the idea that you can either be a scientist or marry a scientist, but actually not that much. And I won't go through this in detail because these slides are going to be available, but there's clear evidence of the relationship between the kind of stereotypes of women really not being suitable for science and their representation in that science. And you might think, well, surprise, surprise. So I think that's something that we need to bear in mind. If the culture that we're all involved in still has particular stereotypes, conscious or unconscious, then this is going to have a direct effect on the behaviour of the very people that we want to encourage to do science. They will become sensitive to rejection, they're very sensitive to stereotype threat, and this is something we need to be aware of. This starts very early. I mean, this is a study done on 6-year-old girls and boys. They were given two different games that they'd never seen before. One was described as being for very, very smart people. Another one was for people who try very hard. And the data here demonstrate, and these are 6- and 7-year-old girls, that the boys were eagerly choose the one that was for very, very clever people, whereas the girls were rejecting it. And the try hard game, you get a sort of reverse effect. So the scientists who are coming to us have, some of them, been exposed to a very negative life experience from the age of 6, less than that even. And therefore there's quite a lot of unpacking to do, and a lot that we need to do in terms of trying to solve that problem. It's also the case that if people do well in science, there's a different kind of explanation. Suggestion that the really, really successful scientists, it's some kind of innate skill, and the belief in that, the powerful belief in that innate skill, is directly reflected in gender gaps. So those sciences which have the biggest belief in some kind of innate ability are science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Again, a correlation and association, but something we should be aware of and should be looking at. When women do well, their work is described as slow, hard effort, possibly as part of a team, which women themselves very often acknowledge. Whereas where men do well, it's a light bulb, there's a kind of genius. And I drew these two pictures because these are two individuals worked on exactly the same problem during the war. And her work, Hedy Lamarr, who happened to be a film star as well, was described in seed-type nurturing terms, whereas George Antale got the light bulb score. And similarly, we all know stories where women have been referred to in science communication. People look at anonymized abstracts or abstracts which have been mixed up and actually given false names of males and females. They will rate them differently. And this actually, the Matilda effect, which is the name given to this effect, was something done on conference abstracts. So something that we ourselves need to be aware of. So this brings me to the end, in good time, unusually for me, to say there are different explanations for this underrepresentation of women in STEM. Out there, and I say out there advisedly, there is a suggestion that we're still looking at this kind of essentialist argument, which is believed not only by the people espousing that kind of argument, but actually also by sometimes a lot of the women themselves. So we as neuroscientists do have an explanation to say, science, look at what happens when you put an individual, a social individual who needs contact, who needs to belong to an in-group, if you put them in a culture which is unwelcoming to them, where there are clear gender gaps, no role models, etc. And where people think, do I really belong? And if I don't, I'll choose to go elsewhere. And I'm glad you didn't. Thank you very much.